Yeah, you already mentioned them. But before I try to speak to them, let me uh, uh, just respond, weigh in rather on the points made about passing legislations or proposed legislations with the speed of light, especially when they are executive based. Have listened carefully to the responses of the distinguished senator and the right honorable gentleman. And maybe I didn't get it right, but I want us not to pass the impression that we can afford to be to be somewhat casual. We can afford to allow some lack of deep thoroughness, lack of scrutiny in interrogating proposed legislations, especially if they are from the executive. I mentioned earlier in response to your first question how the ruling establishments, the presidency and the ruling party would like to have a national assembly that would be collaborative and speed up the delivery of its programs and objectives, which is fine. But that does not mean that the National Assembly should look away or should dilute the solemn responsibility of being a check and a balance to the executive arm of government. Especially in a case where you have a very strong presidency, like we've always had in our country. You have a presidency that is also somewhat, and the president is an alumni of the National Assembly. The vice president is also an alumni of the National Assembly. There are at least 22 members of the cabinet, the current cabinet of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who are members, all were members of the National Assembly. Yeah, so there is that integration. There is that what we call in other people the flex phenomenon. Those who have moved from the legislature, to the executive. So that influence is there, and we can't rule it out because especially if the presidency, with all its good intentions, no doubt, wants things to move really quickly, that can happen, but not at, on the altar of thorough scrutiny. We have seen the 10th National Assembly pass bills, like you have mentioned, the National Assembly bill, with the speed of light. There may not be anything wrong with that, but when the impression is given that, look, for a matter or as important, as solemn, as the national anthem that is like the national ethos of this country, of the country, is not put through robust debates. Nigerians didn't have that opportunity to robustly debate it and say, look, this is what we want. We could argue that Nigerians are represented by members of the National Assembly. And you have, procedures and processes in place, including public hearings. I do not think that we have public hearing, in passing that legislation, for instance. So the point I'm making quickly before I go to your question is that yes, it is important to have, given the state of things of our economic, they need to move quickly. It is important to have the National Assembly, concur and have the objectives and programs of the presidency, of the executive, move forward and smoothly. But that should not be at the expense, of sacrifice. The onerous, the sacred duty of, being a check and a balance to the executive arm of government. Now, having said that, the National Assembly also has, done some great work in the last 1 year. You have mentioned some of them. The ongoing consideration of the tax reform bills is very much welcome. One of the things that usually happen with this kind of very deep, far-reaching reform is, the level of political resistance, that usually would follow it, and that's what we're saying. The way those bills, I have read them, have been politicized, have been discussed, strictly from the prism of politics. I do not think is also correct, because they are very, very interesting and important, benefits that ordinary citizens, businesses, it would that the country as a whole would derive from those proposed legislations. And those are the highlights. Those should be the highlights of public conversations. So what the National Assembly needs to do, what stakeholders need to do, is to steer the conversation towards those very important, salient, propositions of the bill, the value propositions of those tax reform bills. That's what needs to happen. And we're already working on some of those kind of things at other paper. But the point is, yes, if we have this level of interrogation and scrutiny, consultations on the tax reform bills, we should expect to see some of those, on other bills brought in by the president, and indeed by other members of the National Assembly. I do not see the urgency, in needing to pass a bill on establishing a federal university that requires it to go through such speed of light in the Senate. By the way, it's also important to know that we have a preponderance base in the current National Assembly. We need to know why. In an era where we have, a strain on public finances, a strain on revenue, we keep seeing a deluge of, establishment bills that is almost becoming a pattern. You look at the other paper, you see almost every member wants to have an institution, an agency, a college of education, one thing or the other established in his constituency, in his name. We do not think that is appropriate and right, given the state of our public finances and given the need to streamline government, and shrink government. I think that the National Assembly needs to pay attention to that. Then back to the question of, highlights of these, I think that this National Assembly needs to be commended with the speed with which it considered and passed the minimum wage bill. Those are the kind of legislations that, are really people-oriented. They go to the heart of delivery, service delivery to the people, the lives and living conditions of Nigerians. So that is one bill that also, of course, should be highlighted, right? And, there are other bills, like you mentioned, the budget. The annual budget estimates that in 2023, yes, I think there was not sufficient time because they needed to keep the fiscal cycle, January to December fiscal cycle, which unfortunately would now not be happening with 2025 budget as we now have it. Yes, but plus and minus, I think that there are some highlight points that the National Assembly deserves some commendation for the year 2024. And we also need to request them most respectfully, to be mindful of the sacred duty that they hold to Nigerians, to hold the executive arm of government to account.
Okay, thank you.